So today we have Dr. Lisa Maher discussing early occupants of Cyprus, coastal arrivals and inland explorations. Lisa Maher is an associate professor in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, where they focus on prehistoric archaeology and geoarchaeological approaches to reconstructing human landscape interactions. Her research explores the life history of place and how landscapes are created through people's relationships with each other, the environment, and the material world. She has been directing archaeological research projects in Jordan for 25 years and worked in many other countries throughout the Middle East, North Africa, Asia, and North America.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction. I'll put this over here, I think, for now. And thank you all for coming today, especially. I know anxiety levels are probably very high with these very fraught elections, but let's try and have a little escapism at the moment and dive into prehistoric Cyprus. There we go. So for those of you who know me, and especially if you've taken classes with me, you know that I love reconstructions, artistic reconstructions of the past. And one of the things that I really love about reconstructions is that it gives you kind of a nice, vivid visual experience of what the past may be like. There are a lot of issues with doing these reconstructions, like thinking about what gender is performing what activities. This is a reconstruction that's actually done by a former Berkeley student of mine who worked on my project for a number of years in the lab, took a number of classes with me, and I asked her to do a reconstruction of my project in Jordan. So already I'm on a bit of a tangent, which for those of you taking classes with me, you know I also like to do. So one thing that I wanted to point out with our reconstructions is that we've tried to be very careful about the ways in which we are portraying people and identity in the past, but also the activities that they are doing, and of course, who is performing them, which is why we have an elderly lady who is teaching a younger generation to flint-knap. But one of the reasons why I also like reconstructions is that I think it really visually puts together a lot of data that we spend time working as specialists and working with specialists to try and understand from a particular site. Faunal data, plant data, data from stone tool working, data from geoarchaeological investigations, all different realms that we try to reflect in these reconstructions. At least that's what a good reconstruction should do. So the image that you see here is all based on actually very careful thought and data that we have acquired over many years of working in this particular site in Eastern Jordan. Now, what I'm actually going to talk about today is Cyprus, and I've talked about my work in Cyprus for the last couple of brown bags, and so I'm going to take a slightly different tact today. And at least part of the reason why I was in Cyprus last summer, generously funded by the stall, was to participate in a workshop that the Cypriot American Archaeological Research Institute, or CARI, hosts every year, where they ask directors who are doing survey and excavations across the island, well, across the Greek part of the island, to come together and present what they're working on. And this is a really, I think, important part of the Cypriot archaeological community. So you get a chance to talk with each other, to show stuff you haven't published yet, and say, hey, do you know what this is? Have you seen this before? And one of the things that we really wanted to do at this point in our project, which is still very much getting off the ground in terms of it really expanding into a larger term project where we're going to do some excavations, hopefully in future, is we wanted to start to put together a visualization of some of the questions that we have and some of the answers that we already have a sense of for the early peopling, the earliest arrivals or settlers on the island of Cyprus itself. And so I asked the same student who had been doing reconstructions for us in Jordan to do a similar one for Cyprus. And I gave her a few pieces of information that we had, a few guesses on things like what the structures might look like, what watercraft might look like, and I'll talk about all these different things throughout the talk, but to try and get a sense of what life might be like for especially these very early coastal occupants on the island of Cyprus. And this is what we came up with. And what I am going to try and do over the next 40 minutes or so is talk about how we arrived at different aspects of this reconstruction based on the admittedly incomplete and spotty information that we have so far, not just from our project, but what has been going on elsewhere in Cyprus in terms of understanding early occupation of the island. Now, in difference to previous talks that I've given on the island, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the island itself, its ecology and geology, at least as we know it right now. And so one thing that I want to highlight, in previous talks, I've spent a lot of time kind of demonstrating the viability of seafaring amongst these earliest hunter-gatherers. And I think that we're pretty confident that this was a doable thing for hunter-gatherers, certainly 20,000 years ago. And as recent research throughout much of the Mediterranean, particularly in the Greek islands, is demonstrating, is that it likely goes back much, much farther than that. We have a number of Neanderthal sites that are pretty well established on the island of Crete, for example, and a number of other places. But Cyprus, and the reason why it's highlighted as a different color here, is a little bit different than many other islands in the Mediterranean for a couple of really important reasons. Most of these other islands are relatively close to each other. They are, island chains, so to speak, and they are also very well connected to mainlands. So for example, if you are on Sicily, you can see the mainland. This is an example looking out, and from one island, you can see either a mainland or other islands. With Cyprus, that is generally not the case. And one thing that I also wanted to highlight that is not necessarily specific to the Mediterranean, but to understanding the early occupation of islands in general, is that we generally consider water, especially large bodies of water, to be barriers to movement. And that islands could be considered hostile environments for hunter-gatherers in particular, places that are unknown. You don't know what you're going to find when you arrive there. You don't know what you're going to have to bring with you in order to survive in these new places. You don't know in setting out, especially for the first couple of times, whether or not you're ever going to easily make it back again. And so there's a lot of unknowns that are kind of baked into traveling large distances across large bodies of water. And so we often think of these islands as a very risky endeavor, or visiting these islands is a very risky endeavor. And there's actually a lot of considerations that go into many of these water voyages. So thinking about, can you see where you're going, or are you going off into the kind of great blue sea and, hoping that something's going to come up? You've heard stories of it maybe, but you haven't actually experienced it yourself. There's issues of currents. In the Mediterranean, this is particularly relevant. There are a lot of really strong currents, especially around the island of Cyprus. There is questions of what kind of watercraft technology these groups had, these early hunter-gatherers had. There's several possible reconstructions there. Some of the recent research on these crossings has suggested, especially a little bit later in time, where people are truly bringing large numbers of animals, and often large animals, although when they're young and in their small versions, as well as a lot of other things with them, that these would probably have to be pretty substantial watercraft. And in order to make this journey in a reasonable time and to take advantage of currents when they are not terrible, but when they are favorable, you would do this within a certain point of time in the year, and you would do it with sails. And so we can kind of narrow down what some of these watercraft technologies might be for traversing, for example, from a mainland to the island of Cyprus. But that doesn't rule out that people would have had other smaller watercraft for example, skirting around a coastline, or for traveling up substantial bodies of water inland. And then one of the other important considerations is thinking about points of origin and return. And so there are, many different possibilities, and three of these main possibilities are outlined here. So we can look at the kind of far eastern peninsula over to Turkey, or north to Greece from the north coast, or we could think about going to Southwest Asia, the southern Levant here. One thing that I think is important that is not really capsulated in any of these reconstructions is thinking about back and forth movements, not just one-way movements. And then, of course, when you add in currents and time of year and watercraft technology, it's never going to be a direct line, as these arrows suggest. In fact, most reconstructions suggest that even if you are coming from Turkey and you want to land here, well, it's extremely problematic. It's a very rocky, dangerous place to land. Instead, it seems more likely that people would have actually gone counterclockwise around a large part of the island and landed on the south coast. And I'll talk more about those reconstructions in a moment. And then the last consideration, one more thing I wanted to point out. When thinking about these movements and kind of landings on the coast of Cyprus, another important aspect is the underwater topography, the bathymetry. So looking at, for example, the lighter areas are suggesting shallower places. And so these are important in thinking about where currents are going to be strongest and where you're going to be able to land along these coastlines. The last consideration is thinking about cargo, what you're bringing with you on these trips, what you can't possibly do without. This is what came up when I Googled, carrying animals on a boat as the first response, and I had to go with it. So, but our considerations are actually more than just domestic dog, and actually probably were domestic dog from very early on. It was already domesticated in a lot of these mainland areas that hunter-gatherers were coming from. But we know that there's a lot of stuff people would have had to think about bringing. So water, potentially fresh water, if you don't know if you're going to have ready access to that. And of course, you need to drink while you're on the boat. Fuel for when you land. Shelter materials, if you're constructing shelters, clothing and personal belongings. Of course, things that are important to people in their everyday lives would have come with them. Tool making kits, perhaps even the materials the raw materials for making tools. And then, of course, a wide range of plants and animals, some of which would be in various forms in these other different aspects. So we know that some of the early things that arrive on the island include things like wild boar, not domesticated pig, wild boar, probably the dog, and very interestingly, alongside early domestic animals, and we think a little bit beforehand, people were bringing fox and fallow deer, so wild animals, to the island. We suspect they are bringing these animals when they're small. So I say wild boar, but we're probably talking about piglets. I say foxes, but we're talking about kits, deer, and we're talking about fawns, and dogs, and we're talking about puppies. So I couldn't resist a boatload of puppies. But of course, those are the things that people intended to bring with them. Alongside those animals, there would have been a lot of unintended critters, plants, and animals that would have tagged along. And this is what the other side is meant to represent here. So things like insects, perhaps rodents, and any number of other hitchhikers along the way. And so those are important things to keep in mind, especially as we're talking about the impact that the arrival, not just of people, but the things that they bring with them would have had on local ecosystems. Some of those may have been thought out ahead of time by these hunter-gatherers, but some of them were probably not thought out at all. If we take a look at the island of Cyprus, and this relates to thinking about where people may have landed first and what they may have done on this island, just to provide a little bit of context. So we have here a simplified geological map of the island. And I think the significant thing to point out here, and I won't talk too much about this, is that this central geological feature, this bright kind of pink fuchsia colored feature, along with the dark red, are volcanic bedrock complexes. So these are actually uplifted components of what was once a volcano on the ocean floor. Cyprus is at the intersection between European and African plates. And so it's a very tectonically active area. It undergoes earthquakes. Each of these little lines here are representing fault lines. So you can see there's actually, no, I don't have a pointer. There's actually a major arch here of tectonic activity represented by these dashed lines. So the island was uplifted from this central volcanic massive area, and then sediments have been either squished onto it or settled on the foothills of these mountains. So we have a series of igneous and metamorphic rocks mixed in with sedimentary rocks, aeolianites, which are sandstones, and this gray material that you see kind of running through the northern interior, as well as along the coast, are more recent Plio-Pleistocene, so later Quaternary sediments. And these are, marine sediments that have been kind of pushed up and weathered from the mountains to settle along the coastlines. The one thing that I want to point out is this geological map shows the coastline today, but about 10 to 20,000 years ago, that coastline would have looked very different, especially in a post-glacial world. We have, the glaciers are melting, sea levels are fluctuating dramatically around the world. In some places, they're actually raising, and in some places, we have more land exposed as that land rebounds up when glaciers disappear. So what this means for Cyprus is that the past coastlines would have seen more of these gray areas exposed, more of these sedimentary, kind of later quaternary deposits exposed. And at least in this part of the coast here, we would have had about 2 kilometers more of land that would have been exposed and available. So the current coastline is about 2 kilometers further inland than it would have been when these hunter-gatherer groups would have arrived on the island. Meaning that what we are arguing as coastal sites today may have actually not quite been coastal sites. And if we want to know where some of these truly coastal sites are, we have to put our swimsuits on, or rather our diving suits on, in order to explore them. If you remember the underground topography, small inset map I showed a slide or two ago, what that means is that this area is actually relatively shallow compared to very, very deep offshore areas around the island of Cyprus. There's 3 main basins, each of which are really quite deep. So they're about 3,000 to 4,000 meters deep, which is a huge amount compared to the average of the Mediterranean, which is about 1,500 meters in depth. So we got some really deep waters here, which is what in part accounts for the somewhat treacherous currents and water traversing around the island. So what the overall implication of that is in thinking about people and people arriving on the island is that unlike a lot of the other Mediterranean islands, it has been isolated for a very long time. We don't really know of a time at all that it ever would have been attached to the mainland. So even with fluctuating water levels during glacial and interglacial periods, it was an island. And that has really important implications for understanding ecosystems. These deep waters and these really strong currents mean that it is highly unlikely that terrestrial animals from the mainlands would have, coasted on rafts and ended up accidentally on Cyprus. Certainly not in enough numbers to establish populations there. And that means that a lot of the past ecosystem of Cyprus is very, very different than other islands throughout the Mediterranean, as well as from these mainlands that it is, as the crow flies, relatively close to. Okay, so having said all of that, we now turn to talk a little bit about what some of the evidence that we have for early arrivals on the island is. There has been a number of work that has been done recently modeling what settlement of the island of Cyprus would look like. And I'm going to point out 2 papers by the same group of scholars that relate to this topic more directly. One other thing that I wanted to just point out is that, so in the idea that Cyprus has been a relatively closed ecosystem, it's been an isolated insular island for a long time, that has important implications for 2 other aspects that relate to our discussion today. One is that the archaeological history of the island, not until recently, having a lot of different groups going back and forth. It was certainly a nexus in the last couple of thousand years, but thinking back 12,000 years, 10,000 years, we're probably not talking about a lot of archaeological heterogeneity. It also means that paleontologically, when we look at species that were endemic to Cyprus and existed only on Cyprus, it is very, very homogeneous. So it's a little bit easier And one of the reasons why, as I'll point out later on, we can think of Cyprus, like many other kind of isolated islands, as kind of a model ecosystem for understanding the impact of people on their arrival. So it's easier to look at trends on this island than it is compared to island chains or to continents, where you have a lot of heterogeneity and large gaps in your spatial knowledge of what's going on from an archaeological and a paleontological perspective. And so we can start thinking about what that means for people arriving on the island. And this idea of Cyprus, like my colleague Pat Kirch argues for Hawaii, as a model ecosystem to see what the impact of newly arrived populations would be. I wanted to find a picture to accompany this. My son was learning about ecosystems last year in school. So this is his idea of an ideal ecosystem that he drew. So we have the sun, which I love with the shades on already, seagrass, which is eaten by an Atlantic blue tang, which is eaten by a barracuda, which is eaten by a hammerhead shark. I don't know that that's really the way it plays out, but you get the sense that everything is linked to everything else in these ecosystems. So when humans arrive and they change one aspect of an ecosystem, it can have really significant down the line impacts on a range of different species. And one of the big questions that arrives out of Cyprus is a debate about the role of humans, like many other places in the world, in driving particular species of megafauna to extinction. So before I talk about that more specifically, I wanted to go over one of these new models for the kind of peopling and dispersals of people on the island of Cyprus. And this map that is behind, which I'll highlight more in a second, comes from this paper by Bradshaw and colleagues from earlier in 2024. Demographic models predict end Pleistocene arrival and rapid expansion of agropastoralist humans in Cyprus. So what they model here, looking at a number of different archaeological sites, I want to point out that most of these archaeological sites are much later than the time frame that we're talking about here. So they're using knowledge on known dated sites, and in fact, we could probably now add a lot more to this, and how those spread across the island to kind of reflect back earlier in time to suggest where the earliest landing points would be and how quickly people may have spread through the island. And what they suggest is actually quite interesting. They suggest that arrivals would have happened between 13 and 14,000 years ago, which is about 500 to 1,000 years earlier than the earliest dated site we have right now, which is Akrotiri at Akremnos. That it would have include these early groups of people would have reached as many as 1,000 to 1,400 people. So in the earliest phases of arrival on the island, and that this would have happened in 2 to 3 main events within 100 years to establish a population on the island. So what that means is that instead of thinking about a boat with a couple of people and a couple of things in it traversing across, we're talking about like a small fleet of boats going, which is a much bigger endeavor than I think we had really imagined for early arrivals on Cyprus. I have lots of criticisms of this paper, but I also think it gives us some really interesting things to think about, especially if we're talking about the idea of islands being risky places to travel to, that there's some aspect of safety in numbers. You get into trouble while you're on the water, then you have other people who can probably help you out. And so what they're suggesting is, and they've kind of color-coded it here, our earliest sites are actually, as I mentioned, the dated site of Akrotiri at Akremnos. And then there are a couple of coastal sites here, which are actually not on this map, that are undated, but that I'll talk about in a moment, look very much like the material culture we find at Akrotiri. So what they're suggesting is that here, where we know we have this shallow plain that would have existed, if you remember, I talked about sea level being farther out from the coast than it is now, and this kind of shallow sandy plain where landings would have been much easier than, for example, over in this peninsula here. So early arrivals being here, whether or not they were coming this way, which is actually super challenging for the currents, or going most of the way around the island and arriving here, and then actually spreading, according to their models, very, very rapidly from west to east. So they're talking about only a few, but large-scale organized events with what would probably had to have been relatively advanced watercraft technology being the mechanism for getting to the island. And that once people arrived, they spent some time on the coast, but they also went inland very rapidly and, it feels like made a beeline for as far as they could get on land, going eastward. So within about 200 years, they argue on their models. And they also argue that once people arrived on the island and started spreading out across the island, that populations would have grown quite rapidly, so that there'd be 4,000 to 5,000 people on the island in less than 300 years, or about 11, shortly less than 11 generations. And so what that means is that the island of Cyprus is not a hostile, risky environment per se. So rather than this, reproduction of Skull Island here, or some of the things that are displayed here, it actually may have been an attractive or favorable locale. I Googled for this image in the bottom, I Googled, I think, world's most dangerous islands or world's most hostile islands or something like that. And I looked at this and I really wanted to include it. And I was like, actually, this makes a lot of sense, because what it does is it highlights some of those risky things that people would have had to think about when moving to a new place, especially an island like Cyprus. So not necessarily anthrax, but thinking about pests and diseases. So sicknesses, the exposure to new parasites, new bacteria, new viruses, new diseases would certainly be an issue. Thinking about new ecosystems, what animals are friendly and what animals are not friendly that you're going to encounter. Thinking about this little ghost here. So taboos against traveling to specific places or traveling to specific aspects of a landscape. And those, I think, would very quickly come into people's everyday experiences. With Bikini Atoll, thinking about environmental risks. Is water safe to drink, or is it not safe to drink? And then with the Northern Sentinel Islands, who are you going to meet there? They had no idea when they first arrived at Cyprus that nobody else would be on the island. And then, of course, if we're talking about several generations between first arrivals, at year 0, and who knows how many arrivals at, 250 years later, even in their scheme, 250 years is a long period of time for you to not know who else is going to be there and how your encounters with them are going to go. So all of those things turn out to be relevant when thinking about some of the considerations for arriving in a new place, whether or not it's an island. So, but what was it that actually made the island itself very attractive? Well, 2 of those things we think relate specifically to the 2 big megafauna species which existed on the island of Cyprus. So these are the pygmy or dwarf hippo, Phaneurius minor or minutus, it's written both ways, I'm not sure which is actually correct, and Palaeo-Loxodon cypriotes. So we're looking at the pygmy hippo and the pygmy elephant. So these are very interesting. They are very much dwarf versions of their larger counterparts. So ancient DNA evidence suggests that the dwarf hippo on the island of Cyprus diverged from the common African hippo around 1.4 to 1.6 million years ago. So it's probably been on that island, secluded, because it's an insular place, for at least 1 million years. Unlike its African counterpart, it is not an aquatic species per se. It's much more terrestrial. So it's classified as a terrestrial browser. And that's based on the morphology of its skull in particular, the position of tusks and the position of teeth and nose configuration and all that kind of stuff. And it would have weighed about 130 kilograms. So not very different from the images that you can Google now of pygmy hippos. The dwarf elephant, the pygmy elephant, is about 530 kilograms, so substantially larger, but less than 10% of the size of a mainland elephant. And just to give you a sense of that. So here's what we're talking about for male, female, and calf of the pygmy elephant. And we know that this is actually derived from the straight-tusked elephants of Europe and Western Asia at some point during the middle to late Pleistocene. So again, probably almost about 1 million years ago, 500,000 to 1 million years ago. If we take a look at where we find fossil sites of these, we find them in one location with an archaeological site. So again, that early dated site that I mentioned, Akrotiri Atakremnos, but there are a number of other places where we find paleontological evidence of both these hippos and these elephants. And what you'll note is that it's not everywhere on the island. It is predominantly on the west coast here, so in and around the area of Paphos up to the Akamis area, this little peninsula, as well as here along this in the southeast coast and along the north coast. Part of that is likely because these are less developed areas of Cyprus. We have a lot of development and farming in these areas, so it could be that we've just missed finding those fossil sites there. There's been a lot of effort to look for the relationship between humans and pygmy hippos and pygmy fossils, with the idea, based on what we know from Akrotiri, that humans may have had a heavy hand in their extinction. And so people have focused a lot of work on these coastal sites. But this is the data that we have right now. What this could potentially indicate, though, is that if people are arriving here first, they are coming across, especially these pygmy hippos, deciding they're pretty favorable prey to rely upon, big, slow-moving package of meat that's not really afraid of you. And if you want to kind of keep up these large growing populations, then you need to find more and more places where you're going to access these pygmy hippos, as well as the pygmy elephants, which might suggest why we see a rapid spread from east to west, I'm sure among other reasons as well. And this paper, the second paper by Bradshaw and colleagues, who also put forth the modeling paper I just mentioned, suggests that small groups of hunter-gatherers, even newly arriving hunter-gatherers on the island, could have driven these animals to extinction, these megafauna species to extinction, within about 1,000 years. We know they are large packages of meat, pretty substantial amount of meat for any one of them. And just to give you a sense, at the site of Akrotiri Atakremnos, they've reconstructed in one layer alone almost 200,000 pygmy hippo bones, which they equate to about 500 individuals. 500 individuals, each of which is 130 kilograms. It's very impressed by that. Is a lot of meat. So we know that we don't know, but it's very likely that given the energy demands of these hunter-gatherer populations, their diet composition, which I'll talk about in a moment, prey selection, and hunting efficiency, and I'll talk about the stone tools in a minute, that it's not actually unfeasible, that this rapid rate of extinction could have taken place. One of the reasons why it's very likely people would have targeted the pygmy hippos and the pygmy elephants is that endemic species to the island, aside from these two big packages of meat, are really low. So it's very low biodiversity. Other mammals, terrestrial mammals on the island would have included bats, gannets, or these kind of felids, shrews, as well as a variety of mice and rats and gerbils, rodents, basically. One thing that is really interesting that this model did not mention at all, which is what I've added in the photo that I haven't mentioned, is sea mammals. So there are a lot of places along the coast that are nesting sites for turtles, for sea turtles, as well as for a number of different species of seals. Of course, it's also possible, if you can build a boat and carry a lot of stuff from one place to another, from one point of land to another, you could also probably hunt some of these things from those boats. Whales also. So there's a rich repertoire of sea mammals that could have been taken advantage of by these early island occupants, which are not featured into these models at all. So as I was preparing this presentation, I was like, but one of the things that I love doing when I'm in Cyprus is going to the beach and seeing the turtles and seeing the seals there. So of course, people probably would have taken advantage of those. So that might change this dynamic. But with the model that they're arguing for, everything here is pretty small. If you want to get a big package of meat and you want to do that with kind of minimal effort, then your prey choice is going to be the pygmy hippos and the pygmy elephants. So knowing these kind of things allowed them, they suggest, to model the rate of extinction of these large-bodied mammals as soon as people arrived. There's a lot of unknowns that go into this model. So, of course, one of those things is the turtles and seals that I just mentioned, but we don't know exact dates of arrival. We have a ballpark figure, but their dates of 13 to 14,000 years ago are models based on a number of other sites, which is an incomplete picture for sure. We don't know the patterns of expansion and settlement throughout one ecosystem, let alone across the island. We know that people were engaged in really complex foraging systems. We assume the case would be the same for Cyprus. So how heavily they were relying on meat as a regular part of their diet is also a big question. Neither of these animals, by the way, are migratory, just to say that. They're quite sedentary. Elephants certainly move, but within this context, they probably had relatively small territorial ranges. The island itself is only about 11,000 square kilometers, so pretty small. And then we don't know what people would have brought with them, aside from what was endemic. So the first people arriving at the island may have brought live animals with them in order to ensure that they would have had food, which could have quickly established as breeding populations, wild or kind of managed very quickly when these groups arrived on the island. One really interesting thing is that we know that around the same time that we find kind of an absence of hippos and dwarf elephants from the archaeological record, we see wild boar appearing. So it may very well be that people are going back and forth, and it's like, hey, there's been a lot less of these pygmy hippos than there have been in previous years. So maybe next time we go back and forth, let's bring some wild boar back, something comparable, and stock the island. They weren't domesticated. They were most definitely wild boar, and they were pretty small versions of them. So people are already from very early on thinking ahead and planning ahead in how they're going to be manipulating the ecosystems of Cyprus in various ways. All right. So some of the earliest Cypriot sites, and in previous talks, I've mentioned a lot about these sites before. So I'm going to go over this very briefly, mostly just to show you pictures of what these sites look like and what the work that we've been doing looks like. So I can kind of come to the conclusion in the next few minutes. So when we look at these hunter-gatherer sites, so the earlier map I showed talked a lot about early Neolithic sites, and only one actually hunter-gatherer site, which is this Akrotiri Atakremnos that I mentioned. We can see that there's not a lot out there. Keeping in mind, this research for the earliest sites is really only being done in Greek Cyprus, not in Turkish Cyprus. So there's a whole realm of unknown in the northern part of the island. So that is a caveat. That is something that we can't help at this moment. We work with the data that is available to us. So if we take a look, we can see the sites fall into kind of two categories. There's kind of coastal sites and inland sites. And the coastal sites include Akamas Aspros, Akrotiri Atakremnos, and Nisi Beach. Again, this is the only one that is dated along the coast. And our inland sites, you can see, are not in the height of the Troodos Mountains, this area right here, which is still quite forested, but they're in the foothills of the Troodos Mountains, and they're in these major river valleys that drain from the mountains towards the coast. So the site of Drusilla, Skliniki is here right at the kind of boundary to this Akavos Peninsula, which is a nature reserve today and has been for quite a while. It preserves a lot of forests that we think represents what some of the early ecosystems of Cyprus would have looked like. Another is Agios Aeonis Rudius here in the foothills of the Troodos, and Armenochori Pactomeni that you can see right there. And so I'm just going to show you images of what some of these look like. Nisi Beach right here is a surface site. It has no datable materials. It has no faunal materials. It has only lithic scatters, which are on the surface of this very heavily eroded aeolianite deposit. So basically you find little pockets of sediment, and this is the bedrock right here. Wherever you find those pockets, you can find lithics like we've picked up just walking across the site. So we get a sense of what people were doing in terms of making stone tools, what raw material they were using. It seems like it was a pretty small campsite, but we have very little idea other than that of what this coastal site would have looked like. I've mentioned already this site with the pygmy hippos. It is in a collapsed rock shelter today, in a very precarious position to excavate. But keep in mind, the coast would have been about 2 kilometers out to sea when it was occupied about 13,000 years ago. And so it would have been probably up above a gently sloping plain out to the ocean. It is incredibly rich in pygmy hippo remains, which I mentioned already, about at least 500 different individuals represented, alongside a rich repertoire of other material culture, including stone tools, including beads, including incised stones. We have evidence for intensive butchering of these hippos. There are hearths at the site, nicely stratified hearths. We have over 70 radiocarbon dates for the site. It's pretty secure. People were hunting hippo here. We've got cut marks on bones. And people were living here, and people were really, really intensively exploiting these hippos about 13,000 years ago. The site of Aspros is very much like Nisi Beach. You can see this really harsh aeolianite deposit here, although there are some areas with more sediment cover, in which case we can find stone tools like this. This is my co-director, by the way. And you can see this site is very much on the coast. It would have just been kind of a shallow shelf out towards the water itself here. So this one of all that I've just showed is probably the closest to the coast that it would have been when people first arrived on the island. If we look at some of the more inland sites, this one that is right near this Akamos Peninsula, you can see it's very, very forested. And it is probably our best sense, not exactly, but our best sense of what this ecosystem would have looked like when people first started moving up these river valleys inland, especially towards the Troodos Mountains and then crossing over them or skirting around them and moving eastwards. So open, dry grasslands, pockets of evergreen shrubs, small trees, high forested areas in the mountains, and lots of actually fresh water in these inland places. And this is where we start to see a larger, at least more substantial occupation, actually. In part, preservation is hindered what we are able to access on the coast. But it also seems that people were spending more time inland, and they were really investing in things like architecture. So we have paved surfaces here, we have low stone walls, we have stone tools, and the use of a very unique raw material in Cyprus, picrolite, which is a very soft stone that is used for carving, which becomes extremely popular in the Neolithic period and later. And it's one of the things the island actually becomes known for in the wider region, is its trade in this particular type of raw material. Just last summer, actually in the spring, these guys, a French team, excavated at the site of Pactomeni. And this is, again, up one of these major river valleys. They opened up a very large area. They actually used a bulldozer to scrape off about 50 centimeters of really recent paleosoil. Underneath that is where they found these deposits. They found several round structures with post holes, floors, a lot of stone alignments, walls, pits, and one final remain, which was a rat incisor. So not telling us a lot about animal use at this site, but one of the first places, especially inland, where we have really great stratigraphy to work with, where we can talk about a range of different activities people were doing on the site, and where we can get really good dates, which place the site at around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago. And we visited here after the excavation had closed. The only thing you can see some of the stone tools here, which are not easily visible in their publications so far. They've got thousands of stone tools from this site, by the way, about 4,000 stone tools, which is way more than we have in these coastal areas. And one thing I wanted to point out is that from this site, you can see the coast. So the ocean really isn't that far away. We talk about it as being inland, but it's a day's walk to get to the coast if you really wanted to. And so this is some of the work that we've been thinking about more recently with the project that I'm involved in, the Ancient Seafaring Explorers of Cyprus project. Again, I've showed several of these slides already, so I'm going to go through them very, very quickly. I just want to show you images of the material culture so you can place it within the context of the numerous sites that I just showed you. So we have been particularly interested in thinking now about connections between the coast and the inland. We know that it was not such a big divide between being on the coast and being inland. It was probably something that was regularly traversed by people. And that has important implications for understanding how we see these coastal sites, especially these undated surface scatters, which we've found a lot of in our recent work in Cyprus, surveying along this south coast. So this area right here, the star is highlighting this particular point that we focused a lot of work on. And you can see this aeolianite here, where we have very little subsurface deposits to work with. We have documented a number of sites that sit today in this kind of cliffside setting, but keeping in mind the coast would have been 2 kilometers out from here. And so we would have had kind of an overlook over a kind of shallow, gentle slope towards the ocean itself, and perhaps towards beaches that are a little bit more easier to access than they are here today. We excavated 2 of these sites, Mazatos Betunda 1 and Mazatos Betunda 2, very recently. You can get a sense of what these look like here. And really what we are doing is digging small pockets of sediment between otherwise exposed bedrock. We found very little subsurface. This is the other side here. We found very little subsurface, but extremely rich surface deposits. So in all likelihood, we are looking at very deflated sites. Organic material is not there. Material to date these sites is not there, but we have a lot of lithics to work with. So some of these lithics you can see here, we have a lot of blade material. We have a lot of these very small cores, which are extremely characteristic for the site of Akrotiri, which they're named after. They're called Akrotiri cores. But we find these consistently at all of the sites that I've talked about so far. And these small little bladelets that are part of projectile weaponry. We have evidence for scraping, so for hide working. We have evidence for burins and awls for drilling, perhaps shell and wood, although that is not preserved at these sites. We have evidence for butchery tools, so they are making larger knives and other kinds of blade tools, but they are also making a lot of this projectile weaponry. So these small little bladelets, and you can see other examples here, more examples of these Akrotiri cores. A wide range of raw materials are used at the site. They are using stuff that they're finding on the coast, but some of this we know has its source, which you can easily track if you follow these big river valleys up towards the Troodos Mountains. And so access to more and larger pieces of raw material, especially this really beautiful, high quality, chocolate colored raw material, may have been one of the impetuses, alongside perhaps looking for more tasty pygmy hippo, that people would have made their way up these river valleys inland. These are the kind of typical tools that define this time period. One of the things that we also really need now is comparison between different sites in a more rigorous way, looking at these stone tools themselves. So we tend to use the presence of these Akrotiri cores as a diagnostic feature, that these are hunter-gatherer groups. We don't find them in later Neolithic sites, but now we're at the point where we're starting to get more of these sites, and we need to do this in a little bit more consistent way. And just another example of what some of these look like from the type site per se, from Akrotiri Atakremnos. And so if I come back, just to wrap up, if I come back to this article by Bradshaw about the role of humans in extinction, we usually think of extinction events as kind of either a playoff between it was caused by the environment or it was caused by humans. If people arrive before, especially just before the extinction of these animals, we assume that people had a pretty heavy hand in doing this. What they're modeling here is the speed at which this could have happened. And so what they're arguing is that with a relatively small number of people, up to 3,500 people on the island, which they say could happen within about 200 years, then you could have almost complete hunting of these pygmy hippos and elephants, but a little bit longer for elephants, to extinction. And if we time out when people arrive and when we see these extinction periods, we have humans arriving here according to their model. Even if we shifted it a little bit over here, they're still arriving. We have several dated sites now before the complete extinction of pygmy hippos, which go extinct before pygmy elephants. They hang on a little bit longer. And so it seems that people really did have a heavy role in doing this. And it might make sense in that perspective to think about the importance of bringing things like wild boar to the island to substitute for this animal that you very quickly become quite dependent on. I'm going to skip over that. So then I come back to our reconstruction, and this is the last thing that I wanted to talk about. So our reconstruction here is trying to capture what we think would have been coastal occupations early on, for sure, but perhaps not the biggest occupations, perhaps still very well connected to groups who may have been going inland. These guys are meant to be roasting pygmy hippo here, where people would have first encountered this species, especially at the site of Akrotiri. We have some guesses based on what we think people were bringing, what boats may have looked like. We know that they would not have been, 3 people that would have arrived at a time. They're probably talking about larger groups of people, which means that we are not talking about kind of sporadic arrivals of early hunter-gatherers. We're talking about kind of organized, larger groups of hunter-gatherer communities that are arriving on the island and that are very, very quickly shaping what it looks like afterwards and subsequently. So that by the time Neolithic farmers were arriving, the island was already very different than it would have been when hunter-gatherers first arrived. My last slide, my pre-sunset sunset slide. While we were there this June, it was extremely hot. It was the massive heat wave in Europe. I got the warning from the UC Berkeley World Q thing as I was leaving in the airport to go there. And of course, because of current geopolitics in the area, our GPS never worked. So we couldn't use Google Maps to get from one place to another on the island because it was always being scrambled by Israeli satellites. So I was actually trying to go from right here to the capital in Nicosia. For those of you who know it, I was trying to go to a very awesome jewelry store, which I'm wearing their jewelry today. And it told me I was in Lebanon and that it was going to take me quite a while to get there. So the fun of doing fieldwork in Cyprus this summer. And with that, thank you all for your attention today. Yeah.
Sorry, so I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting. Rest in peace, little pygmy hippos and elephants.
I know.
My goodness. But I was so interested by the idea of this wild boar infusion going on. And I was just wanting to ask if you see any other sort of conspicuous evidence of things coming in from the outside, so like any foreign raw material. And because Christine is not here, I of course have to ask what your assumptions are about the plantscape on Cyprus at this point in time, and if people are potentially bringing anything in.
Yeah, so I have to say most of that is based on assumptions at the moment.
Yeah.
We have a super hard time finding faunal remains at these early sites. The particular geochemistry of the soil just really eats faunal remains completely and plant remains. So I would not want to base a dissertation as a graduate student on doing flotation on these early Cypriot sites, because you'll be lucky if you get just a few things. But it changes dramatically once you get into the Neolithic. So we know in the Neolithic, people brought a whole range of different plants and animals with them. And I highlighted some of them on an earlier slide. So people brought wild animals, fox, deer, wild boar, presumably also wild plants. We just don't have good evidence for that. We know they brought domestic plants. So they brought wheat and barley and things that are actually very common on the island right now. I'll go one more, actually. We assume they would have brought fuel with them, at least to start with, which means they may have brought even saplings with them. They may have brought live plants with them, which is what this image is meant to represent. But we don't have any evidence for it until later on in the Neolithic, when we know they brought cats and dogs and cattle. Cattle are super interesting because they bring them once, then they disappear for a couple thousand years, and then they bring them back again. So people are making very, very intentional choices of what's coming to the island. But of course, that doesn't mean there isn't a huge impact from a lot of these unintended hitchhikers to the island as well.
Thank you so much.
I wish we had more evidence.
I'm sorry, I didn't see whose hand was first. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you.
Hey, Alicia, good to see you.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much. I have a few questions, actually many questions, but one of them was just asked, and I'll limit myself to just 2.
Sure.
One, if the coastline was 2 kilometers farther away, and you talked a lot about major river valleys, What do we know about the paleoclimate? Was it wetter? And were the waterways more significant? Were they even significant enough? At some point in the talk, you talked about watercraft that could be used to go inland. All I know is there was one 2007 survey of the Yallas. I would love to hear your take on it, though, after all this field work. Do you think there were significant waterways based on paleoclimate and any geo work?
Yeah, so that's kind of a two-folded question, I guess. Like, yes, we certainly do see geomorphological evidence for more significant water in existing river valleys. So some of these really big river valleys, like the Tremethos Valley River, for example, we know based on sections that are there, and this is a river valley I've hiked myself many times up and down, we know looking at the sections there that there was much more substantial water that was moving through there, likely in a much more regular way. There's been a lot of incision over the last 10,000 years or so, maybe a little bit longer. And the degree of incision that happened to create those river valleys is not happening now. I mean, most of these waterways are trickles in comparison.
Well, but when it floods, it really, I mean,
exactly.
all you need to do is look at Valencia.
When it floods, it really floods. But they're not regular like we think they were in the past. And the work that has been done on paleosols that are exposed along these river valley cuts also suggests that overall there was less seasonality than we see right now. So instead of having a very stark distinction between hot and dry summers and wet winters, it would have been wetter more of the year. Rain would have fallen a little bit more evenly throughout the year. And that's the kind of thing that's necessary for these really deep rubified, like iron-rich paleosols to form. So there is pretty dramatic climate change on the island, which of course has its own down the line effects in terms of these local ecosystems.
So do you think they could have been used as migratory pathways?
Yeah, so certainly for people moving on foot, I think there's no doubt about that. Whether or not people would have taken boats up these, I mean, you could probably take small canoes or rafts or something up them, but will we ever find evidence for that? I don't know. I can say that, but yeah.
And just one more, sorry. You had mentioned no heterogeneity of population at some point. You said in the past 3,000 years, I mean, as we know, there's all these different people that come.
You're not Henry.
So you said two. I just wanted to clarify because you said at one point that there was back and forth, like it wasn't a one-way thing.
Yeah.
So if there was back and forth, why would there not be multiple back and forths like we see in later periods, 3,000 years ago, and later we see continuous contacts with different mainlands, right? Asia Minor, Levant, and other things. So why are you saying that wouldn't have happened in earlier periods? That there wasn't multiple mainlands back and forth?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, actually, because I wanted to clarify that. So what I'm arguing is that the early archaeological record that we see on the island is quite homogeneous, and it matches very closely with what we see from 12,000 to 14,000 years ago in the mainland Levant and Turkey, which if you compare sites in the southern Levant to sites in northern Turkey, they also look very similar to each other. So the comment about not seeing too much heterogeneity is actually reflective of what we see in the larger archaeological record. And I think that has a lot to do with what people are doing with the most durable aspect of material culture that we see at this time, which is stone tools. For Cyprus, that's what we have the most of is stone tools. And what that means isn't that it's the same people who are doing the same things, but what they're doing with those stone tools in terms of food acquisition probably looked very similar, i.e. a lot of projectile weaponry, a lot of tools for butchery and hide processing. So yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to make sure to clarify that I'm talking about the practices that we see, not that the identities
the material evidence
may have been arriving from different area. We're all the same.
So the material evidence and the practices are homogeneous across the island with the surrounding mainland.
So far.
But of course, as good archaeologists, we can't therefore infer that the people are homogeneous. What you're saying.
That's right. That's right. Yes, absolutely.
What are the lithics that are being used for the cores and microblades?
So it's all chert predominantly. There's a little bit of chalcedony, but most of it is chert. That actually most of the sources for this chert come from the Troodos Mountains. So from the foothills of the Troodos Mountains, a whole range of different formations. Is that what you're?
Or is it?
It's hugely variable, actually.
Okay.
if we take a look.
But all cherts.
It's
of
all
varying
various
qualities.
cherts, but hugely different kinds of raw material. So some of this is, this very beautiful fine-grained dark brown material. It comes from a particular Lefkara formation, which is in the eastern foothills of the Troodos Mountains. We have this, nice reddish brown colored material, nice caramel colored material. But there's also stuff that is much more crystalline. So there's kind of a gray crystalline material. There's just a huge range of different qualities and colors of raw material. On the coast, it seems that people are using whatever they can find. So they're actually being quite conservative with raw material. Stuff is tiny. The cores are tiny.
Microplates.
Yeah. And it's probably because when it comes to the coast, it's rolled down, it's traveled down these river valleys. It's quite abraded. It's quite broken up. And so what they're picking up are relatively small pieces to begin with. But because they're coming from a place that already creates small tools and knows how to work with small bits of rock in order to produce what they want, this isn't a particularly big issue. But it may be one of the reasons that I was suggesting people would have moved up these river valleys inland, is to follow these chert sources where you can get bigger and bigger pieces. And then you find their geological sources in the foothills of the Troodos, and you find where different colors come from and different qualities come from. And then kind of the world is your oyster when it comes to raw material here.
Is there evidence for cooking of it to refine, to homogenize it for nap?
Yeah, great question. It's really difficult with this particular material on Cyprus, because the really high quality stuff is already very lustrous. It's already very fine grained. And so, the measures that we use to determine heat treatment of flint are pretty rudimentary. And people have not yet done experiments to see what heat treating some of this looks like. So that's a next step for sure.
Thanks, Lisa. I love the holistic approach. So we really got a sense of the island as if we were actually there. Thank you.
My attempt at
and the work
escapism.
is really moving along, even if you're not yet to real excavation.
Mm-hmm.
Just two completely different things. First of all, do you know anything at all about what was going on the coast that might have been the context within which people would want to set off to go to Cyprus for forever, for example?
Right.
And so
you mean on the mainland?
Yeah, on the mainland.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
what sort of gets people to decide we're all going to pile into boats and, head out someplace else and find a quote unquote better life, which some of us are wanting to do right now. But anyway.
Yes. It's such a good question, because our knowledge of what's going on at coastal sites in the Levant, for example, and it's the same in Turkey, and even in Greece, it's the same, is also really spotty, in large part because probably the key sites that we're most interested in are also underwater. So that's a problem not just in Cyprus, but in the kind of surrounding mainlands or source populations as well. What is really fascinating to me is that who's around in the mainland at that time. In the southern Levant, it's the Natufians, late Epipalaeolithic / Natufians in Turkey. And material culture-wise, it actually looks pretty similar to what we see in Cyprus. But the coastal sites there don't have any indication that people were using the coasts. So you don't find fish remains at these sites. There's like one Natufian site in the entire southern Levant that has fish remains. And there's just a few of them at that. And it's from a freshwater lake. So we don't have evidence for watercraft technology. We don't have evidence, in Northern Europe or many other of these coastal sites. It's very clear they were heavily exploiting marine resources, a variety of different marine resources. We have no indication of that whatsoever in coastal Levant. So why would you suddenly jump into this big body of water and travel somewhere quite distant? Well, the one indication that we do have is that increasingly, from about 20 to 10,000 years ago, these hunter-gatherers are increasingly engaged in networks of trade and exchange and movement. And so it may be that if you've got a really good network going in these kind of continental spaces, that the next step is to explore. Even if you haven't done it before, or it's something that is not, part of your repertoire, it seems that that was clearly of interest to people. And it kind of goes back to some of the questions of why people do these kind of things, why people would engage in these risky behaviors. There's a lot of possibilities. I've talked about them in previous talks. Perhaps they're pushed into it by, not getting along with their neighbors, or too many people trying to live in the same place, or they're just super curious and like, this, we haven't done this before. Let's see where this takes us. So I don't know. That's not a good answer, but it's a really, really interesting question.
Well, it is, and especially at that time scale, a little bit more globally, or at least in Europe, in terms of looking at what's happening with the end of the glacial cycles and opening up of new environments. And there's some really interesting work on how do people navigate into new environments where they haven't been before, and how does that work? So that that literature, people going into what's today northern Belgium and southern Scandinavia and so forth.
And even there was a paper recently looking at ancient DNA of kind of early Cypriot populations from Neolithic sites, so already agricultural sites, in comparison to contemporary agricultural sites in Turkey, in the northern Levant, and then in Greece, and expanding into Europe. And it seems there's a very close connection genetically between these early Neolithic communities and mainland northern Levant, and Turkey in particular, and Anatolia. And so with these connections, like, people could easily have gone with their wheat and their cattle and their sheep and their goat by land into Europe, and they certainly did that. But also a group of them went by boat, and they went to Cyprus, and they hopped along the southern coast. So there's definitely choices towards the water, even when the land options are open, which is quite interesting.
And one completely different question, going to the other side of the world. We do strongly hypothesize, although we have no material evidence of watercraft, for the population movements into what's today Australia. And I just wondered whether some of the work there about the distances are probably not as great as what you're hypothesizing from the Levantine coast into Cyprus, but whether, because they've been working on things like that for some time, and really, pretty sure that one of the main ways people did get into northern Australia was by boat. Whether there's anything in that literature that.
Well, I think yes, absolutely. I think what it does is really demonstrates and makes it easier for us to demonstrate on Cyprus the ability of people to see water as not a barrier, not as something to block movements of people, but to actually encourage and perhaps speed up the movement of people. So it's definitely been a great example of that from very early on, much earlier than Cyprus.
Right. Of course, also the other information from those Australian and Austronesian islands has to do with the way in which many of the megafauna is very, very small. So you get the pygmy, and then you've got the very small that are
that's another good signal for the idea that Cyprus was pretty cut off until recently from other Mediterranean islands. Is that's kind of the signature thing that you get in these kind of insular island ecosystems, especially when there's no prey. When people arrived there have been no prey for them, as in no other animals preying on them, and there were no other animals preying on the pygmy hippos and elephants. So they were, what we think of as naive ecosystems. They had no idea that these humans were going to be a danger. They had no experience of that before. So
here they come.
I know.
I have a quick one. Isn't the Bradshaw model of population growth really fast for foragers?
Yeah, it is very fast. And one of the reasons why they suggest it to be this fast is because of the nature of the island itself. They're like, we think we have a really good sense of what the primary prey would have been, and the ways in which they were hunting this prey based on the stone tools. We have dates for these Neolithic sites, which actually show pretty rapid movements across the landscape. It's 11,000 square kilometers, which is really not that big. There's definite elevation changes, but they're not insurmountable. in terms of, even crossing the Troodos Mountains, although certainly it's easier to go around, but they're crossable. So, there's no seasons where you couldn't cross them or anything like that, although they do get snow sometimes in the winter. So I think that they are using the kind of very, very fragmented available data that we have, but in a, somewhat reasonable way, given the kind of interesting nature of Cyprus. So we have a low biodiversity ecosystem to start with, two main potential prey, both of which would have been very attractive for people to be hunting, and a relatively small space for people to be kind of traversing from one place to another. But as I pointed out, my main criticism now that I've really thought about this is not including resources that would have come from marine sources. So yeah, if I were confronting them at a conference, I would say, what about? Yeah. But yeah, they are fast. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa, for an exciting update on your prior talks. A comment and then a question. Comment would be, is there anything to learn? This kind of falls from what Meg was saying. Is there anything to learn from the Polynesian exploration of the Pacific? I realize it's 10,000 years more recent, but in terms of why people would leave and also how they might guess that there's land somewhere that they can't see, like migratory birds. I just wonder if any of that might be relevant. So that's a comment. And then the question is, seeing as the currents are so important in your model, I just wonder if that amount of climate change and shifting ocean levels would affect the currents. I mean, is it really safe to assume that the currents were the same then, say 12,000 years ago, that they are now? Especially because we're hearing, I mean, even today, climate change is changing currents. So anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with the second one. So the reconstructions suggest that, if anything, the climates would have been a bit more treacherous than they are. And that, so given the fact that Cyprus has these big basins.
Do they circle the same way? That's the question.
Unknown. I think that's pretty unknown at the moment. My understanding, and there's actually not a ton of work that's been done on this, my understanding is they think they would have been roughly the same because of these big deep water areas that surround Cyprus. So the fact that we have these deep water basins would have kept those current directions relatively stable. The big question would be prevailing winds and the shift in prevailing winds, because that's what's going to impact people at the surface in terms of the ability to travel calm or really, really choppy, dangerous waters. And that, if we go back 12 to 14,000 years ago, suggesting during the Younger Dryas and even the kind of warm phase right before that, doesn't seem to have major shifts, at least as people can tell right now, in terms of prevailing winds. There's something else I wanted to add about that. I've lost it now. And your first question?
No, just Polynesians.
Oh, yeah. I mean, from me working with you in Hawaii, that this is also an area I'm particularly interested in, and what the arrival of people, in this case already farming people, would have had on local landscapes and local ecosystems, and this idea of kind of terraforming landscapes in order to make it what you want it to be. And so for me, that idea has really influenced my thinking about the arrival of hunter-gatherers on Cyprus. So while they're not farming communities initially, we know they're bringing interesting things with them. And there's, kind of no doubt that they would have shaped these islands in ways that would have made them more suitable to stay there in larger numbers, especially if these models are even close to correct. And we're talking about large groups of people. So not just checking out what's going to happen if we cross this water, what are we going to find? I think probably they had a really good sense of navigation. And they had a really good sense from things like migratory birds. So Cyprus and actually that whole Levantine coast is on the path of some major migrations of things like storks and a whole range of different species from Africa up into Europe and then back down again. And flamingos, exactly. So people would have actually had knowledge of that, I think, not just when they arrived in Cyprus, but also kind of predating that. And so that probably would have informed them greatly into what to expect when they set off on the water. Yeah.